the Romantic period, the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century, when we get a flowering of this new conception of self-exploration in what I want to call the expressivist view of the human person. That is, which begins to see people as having a kind of potentiality which has to be realized by self-exploration and self-articulation. And here with writers like Herder, for instance, who I think is an extremely important writer from this point of view, you get what we already see in Montaigne, more or less alluded to, becomes a very clear doctrine. The idea that each human being is radically different. Jeder Mensch hat sein eigenes Maß. Each human being has their own measure, is how Herder puts it. Each human being has their own measure. Each human being is different and has to live up to what they have it in them to be. Our conception of originality, now the one that we live with today, is born at this time. That is the idea that I have it in me to be a certain kind of human being, and you have it in you to be another kind. And this is morally important because it would be a betrayal of me to live according to models that fit you, and vice versa. That we have to discover, each one of us, what our own way of being is. I'm moving. What our own way of being is, and live that. And that we discover this, of course, by a kind of self-articulation and self-examination. Along with this, connected with this, is a revolution in our notion of the place of art in our lives, and at the same time, along with that, a change in our conception of art. Art becomes important in our lives because it's seen now as the paradigm place of self-articulation. In a sense, it almost, in certain variants of this kind of modern view, replaces reason as the crucial human faculty. Art is that by which we articulate what is truly important to us, what is truly ourselves. And here we can see in the changing position of art another way in which the decline, the receding of our conceptions of cosmic order have play off against a new conception of interiority. Perhaps we can see this best if we look at poetry, in a sense the background to poetics, which over this period, let's say 1750 to 1850, changes very radically. Prior to 1750, one can say that there are in the conception of the order of things, of the great chain of being, there are a set of references, and of course in the traditional stories of mythology and in the stories from the Bible and so on, there are a set of references which any poet can draw on, a kind of public language of poetry, which can constantly be drawn on in order to write and create poetry that can be understood by everyone and can articulate for everyone. In this changeover period from roughly 1750 to 18, even earlier, to the early 19th century, we have a receding of that and a sense among poets that they can't rely on that anymore, to which they react sometimes by an attempt to create idiosyncratic mythologies, as Blake does, for instance, or much later Yeats does, a kind of almost a new picture of order of things in the universe, but one purely idiosyncratically invented by the poet himself. Or else they struggle for another kind of language which doesn't even have the solidity or the seeming solidity and permanence of a well-charted mythological view of the universe, but has great elusive force. And the point that I want to draw from this is that in this new conception of what the role of the creative imagination is, the language on which people draw is no longer a publicly available language of well-understood references, but a language which importantly is articulated out of the resonance of things in themselves. It's in a certain sense, inevitably, inescapably now, a subjective language. So it's the hope of every poet that these resonances will also resonate in others, but the references are discovered by resonances within the poet himself. And that is, in a sense, the situation that we find ourselves in, let's say, since 1800, in rather sharp contrast to what existed before. Now, all these things together that I want to draw together are understanding of self-exploration, which I trace back to Montaigne, but we see going through the Romantics. The notion that we are all different from each other and we have to explore what we are as particular human beings, and our conception of the role in this self-exploration of what I want to call the creative imagination, which is now seen as not the power to, as it were, create works of art already building on and leaning on publicly available references, but the power to create new languages out of the resonances of things in ourselves. These three things I want to link together, and together they indicate another conception of what it is to be a human being, another notion of, if you like, moral excellence or spiritual growth or moral growth, the growth towards self-exploration, self-understanding, self-development, self-fulfillment. This word fulfillment, of course, is part of the vocabulary which belongs to this era. And this notion of self-development and self-fulfillment also turns around a stance of radical reflexivity and therefore turns around metaphors of inwardness. In this Montaignian and romantic self-exploration, we have another reason, namely that the self is partly made by its own exploration. And so if in another way, it can't be identified with anything antecedent that can be laid out as this is what a human being is, but it is something that issues from its own reflexive powers. And so for this other reason, we are tempted to think of ourselves as cells. A change comes about in the late 18th century in the whole conception of what art is, roughly speaking, I mean, very, very broad terms, a conception in which the notion of imitation or mimesis was dominant or major, gives way to a conception in which something else, perhaps rather like expression or creation, becomes dominant. And my point would be that change in the notion of art goes along with a change in the notion of what role art plays in human life. That insofar as we develop this expressive view of the human being, the development of my self-exploratory strand, insofar as we develop this expressive view of the human being, where the crucially important thing is being able to articulate is that I complete my develop and fulfill my own life by articulating what I have it in me to be, then art becomes something extremely important, an extremely important human power, because it's the one that is very often seen as the capacity whereby we achieve this articulation. So at one and the same time, art becomes something more important in human life, and in a connected way undergoes a revolution in how it's conceived. These two, I think, fit together. And we have, therefore, today a tremendous tendency to admire the creative artists, to think of creative artists almost like sometimes shamans or seers, to think that they have vision into things which the rest of us don't have. We, in our 20th century civilization, we often give them a kind of status that earlier societies would have given perhaps religious figures or prophets. We often accord that to artists. Music, of course, was, in a certain sense, the the queen art in any way some of the formulations of this change that I described between these two conceptions of art, since it was the one which never could really be convincingly described as mimetic, or very convincingly described as mimetic. It was the one that was least well explained by the old paradigm, by the old conception of art as mimesis, in the way that poetry and visual art were perhaps well explained, and therefore it's not surprising that in the Romantic period, music occupies a special place in people's thoughts as something that almost is the paradigm art. And one gets through this whole period, I mean, right up to Pater and others who talk about that poetry should approach the condition of music, and architecture as frozen music. And of course, Schopenhauer, followed by Wagner, had this notion that music again was something absolutely special, because whereas everything else was an imitation of objectifications of the will, as Schopenhauer put it, music was in some way a direct expression of the will. So I think that in a sense, when you see the shift of the notion of art meant a revolution in the position of various genres and various forms of art, and what has accompanied that has been an immense promotion of music.